With this lesson, we're beginning a new section, a final section really, on textual criticism by looking specifically at some special problems of the text. And for this first lecture on these special problems, we're going to look at 4 passages. Mark chapter 1, verse 41, which talks about whether Jesus was angry when he healed a leper or whether he was compassionate. We'll deal with that issue. John chapter 5, verses 3b, that is the second part of verse 3 and verse 4, in which we read about an angel, in some manuscripts, an angel of the Lord, who stirred up the waters so that the first person who got into the pool of Bethesda was healed, and whether those verses are authentic or not. 1 Timothy 3:16 either says that he was revealed or God was revealed. In both instances, it's clearly speaking about Jesus, but one of them is an explicit affirmation of the deity of Christ, and the other one is probably an implicit one, but it's not explicit. And then finally, John 1:18, and we're going to be looking at 1 Timothy 3:16 and John 1:18 together. John 1:18 speaks of monogenes theos or monogenes huios, or the unique Son, or the unique one himself, God. And so that's a final text that we'll be looking at and making some comparisons. All right, so we'll look at these things fairly rapidly, so you'll need to be taking copious notes to figure out what's going on. Mark chapter 1, verse 41. And to give a little context. Now a leper came to him and fell to his knees, asking for help. "If you are willing, you can make me clean," he said. And then Jesus, of course, is responding to him. Reading number 1, or variant number 1, which is found in the vast majority of manuscripts, all of the Alexandrian, all of the Byzantine manuscripts, but it's not found in the earliest and most important Western manuscripts. Moved with compassion, Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him, saying, "I am willing, be clean." Reading number 2, a distinctively Western reading, says, becoming indignant, Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him, saying, "I am willing, be clean." That's the difference between these two. Now, Mark 1:41 has received a great deal of airtime in the last 10 to 15 years in scholarly circles. There's not been any new evidence that's been uncovered, but there's been a lot of argument and frankly, a lot of debate over this. Just to show you how serious these things are, scholars don't look at this stuff capriciously. There have been whole dissertations on some of these textual problems. There was a dissertation on which word is correct in Mark 1:41 done at Baylor a few years ago. Can you imagine writing 300 pages on that? The scholars take this very, very seriously, and they don't just come out and say, "Oh, I think I'm going to change the text to mess up the average Christian." That's not really what's going on at all. Well, we want to start with the internal evidence, and with that we start with the transcriptional probability. Is there a possibility of an unintentional error? In the majuscule letters, we've got splonchnestheis and orgistheis, and you can see the end of both of these words. The istheis is similar, but that, frankly, is the ending of a standard aorist passive participle that on an idzo verb, I know you don't know what that means, but or some of you don't, but nevertheless, you get that on a number of verbs. I don't think it's particularly likely that a scribe would confuse one of these for the other, especially in a context like this. Jesus is doing the healing, and some scribe who misreads splonchnestheis and says, "Oh, I'm going to make Jesus angry." It just seems there's so many other possibilities of where he could have gone, but to say accidentally, "I'm going to read compassion" as though it meant anger, when you've got quite a bit more text for being compassionate as opposed to being angry, and just the endings is just not adequate to argue for an unintentional error. Well, what about an intentional change? The harder reading clearly here is orgistheis, becoming indignant or getting angry. And we're going to explore this harder reading just a little bit more here. Now, some of this may be a bit disturbing. We're going to actually, in this lesson and in the one on Matthew chapter 24, verse 36, we'll be looking at synoptic parallels at Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And I'm going to treat these in a way that most scholars today are viewing the synoptics. That is, they assume that Mark wrote first and Matthew and Luke borrowed from Mark when they wrote their Gospels. So I'll begin with that assumption. When we, again, looking at the transcriptional probability and thinking about the harder reading, Orgus Theis, Mark was the first Gospel used by Matthew and Luke, which is largely a consensus among most New Testament scholars, although there's some who are fighting against that. Now, what's interesting here is that in the synoptic parallels, both Matthew and Luke have this same pericope. They have this same story. But neither one of them says that Jesus got angry. Well, that is to be expected. Matthew and Luke don't like having a picture of Jesus that looks as rough-hewn as what Mark gives at times. More importantly, neither one of them says that Jesus is compassionate. Now, how is that possible? When Mark says that Jesus is compassionate, Matthew and Luke say that Jesus is compassionate. When Mark says that Jesus is angry, Matthew and Luke say nothing. That's the pattern we see. So what does that tell us Mark had here? The transcriptional evidence suggests that Mark actually wrote that Jesus was angry. And Matthew and Luke are prone to soften Mark's rough-hewn words of Jesus, especially by deleting them, but by changing them at times as well. And yet, what's really significant is, even though they do that, we need to understand this. In terms of historicity, they are telling us the truth about Jesus, but they're also packaging it in such a way that doesn't tell us everything that Mark is going to lay out. Part of the reason for this is what Mark's purpose is as opposed to what Matthew's in particular, because 600 of the 660 verses in Mark's gospel are found in Matthew, so he's cannibalized it extensively. Mark's gospel is meant to be a dialogical gospel. He's trying to get the reader to get engaged in thinking about who Jesus is and come to have ownership over Jesus. I don't mean in the sense of being Lord of him, but really coming to be one who is in close communion with Jesus and a Christ follower by thinking through the issues and thinking through how people are going to speak about Jesus in their own community. So he doesn't varnish anything. Matthew's is not a dialogical gospel, it's a pedagogical gospel. He is trying to teach people, here's the conclusions you need to come to about Jesus. So we have Matthew and Luke being prone to soften Mark's rough-hewn Jesus by deleting words especially. So in Mark chapter 3, verse 5, it says that Jesus speaks with anger, and with anger is absent in Matthew 12:13 and Luke 6:10. In Mark 10:14, Jesus was indignant, but was indignant is absent from Matthew 19:14 and Luke 16:18. So this is predictable, what we see here in Mark 1:41. But you also have other places where they don't remove a verb. Sometimes they'll completely change it. Mark 1:12 is really interesting. There you have, right after Jesus' baptism, he comes up out of the Jordan River, and God says, you are my beloved Son. And then the next verse, the Spirit drives him into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. Well, that's only in Mark. Both Matthew and Luke, independently of each other, they're using different verbs and different tenses on those verbs, but they're using a softer verb. The Spirit led Jesus in, or led Jesus up into the wilderness. It's a much softer statement. Both of them are true, but driving Jesus sounds at least initially, that Jesus may have been unwilling or surprised as to what's next. I think he was trusting the Spirit of God to guide him, and at times that meant that the Spirit was going to take him in places that he did not want to go. As he said, Lord, if it's possible, let this cup pass from me. And so that's not impugning his character. Mark's giving us a more rough-hewn Jesus, though, and it's important for us to think about that. Mark 2:26 is a very famous passage, and it's the passage that Bart Ehrman says is what caused him to basically throw out the Bible as an inerrant, infallible text. When he was in the seminary program at Princeton on his master's program, he wrote a paper on Mark 2:26 where Jesus is speaking to the Pharisees, and they say, hey, look, your disciples are plucking heads of grain on the Sabbath. That's unlawful. And Jesus says, have you never read when David went into the house of God and he and his men ate the showbread when Abiathar was high priest? Now, this is a reference back to 1 Samuel chapter 21. In 1 Samuel chapter 21, David and his men go into the house of God when Ahimelech was priest. Abiathar's father was priest. It wasn't even in Jerusalem. He was not a high priest, just a priest. And so in Matthew 12:4 and Luke 6:4, both places, they just eliminate the words when Abiathar was high priest. Now, I've done a study on this, and there's 6 different views that are taken on how we should treat when Abiathar was high priest. And that's posted at Bible.org. You can look at this. The problem of Abiathar in Mark 2:26, I think is the name of it. I'm not going to deal with that here. I simply want to say both Matthew and Luke apparently didn't want to deal with that issue for their readers. I don't think, and in any sense, they're thinking that Jesus made a mistake, but they may be thinking that some people may read this as a mistake. And that's one of the distinctions that we need to think through. So they just eliminate those words. So that gives you a little bit of feel about what's going on in terms of the Mark, Matthew, Luke synoptic relationships. Now, in terms of intrinsic probability, we can look especially at style. And 2 other times in Mark's gospel, Mark says that Jesus is angry. We've already looked at those, 3:5 and 10:14. And yet each one of those places, it's easy to determine or to see why Jesus would be indignant at his disciples or others on those occasions. This is much more difficult. But this actually fits into Mark's style as well. He's often ambiguous. 21 times, for example, Mark uses an indefinite they where we don't know who the they are. And he's the only one who does this where he's so ambiguous. I've mentioned before, he has 89 verses in a row for Mark 6-8 where he never mentions Jesus by name or by title. And so you've got later manuscripts that punctuate this by adding the name of Jesus 4 times in there. But he's often ambiguous, and here is a classic place where if you have an angry Jesus, there's great ambiguity. Why is Jesus angry? We just don't know. There's a lot of explanations, but this all suggests that we really have a solid A for becoming angry. That, on the internal basis, really looks like it's going to be authentic. Now, when we look at the external evidence, we can look at the date and character of these manuscripts, and you already know about Codex Bezae, Codex D, and I'm giving you some other witnesses here because this is all we've got. These little a and FF2 and RL1 with an asterisk, that is, those are Old Latin manuscripts. And in combination with D, they really tell us that's what the earliest form of the Western text had to say. D, Codex Bezae, is early 5th century. And it's a diglott. It has Greek on the left side and Latin on the right side, as we've talked about and shown a picture of it. But that tells us that that's surely what the Western text had to say. Ephraim wrote a commentary on Tatian's Diatessaron. Tatian's Diatessaron was a document written in the late 2nd century, and we don't have the whole thing. But Ephraim's commentary that comes later is discussing it. And one of the things that's interesting about Tatian's Diatessaron is that what the Diatessaron means, it's through 4, and what Tatian did was he combined all 4 Gospels to make one new Gospel, thinking this would be of service to the church. Later it was branded as not what you should read. We need to read the 4 Gospels in their original form. But Ephraim says that in Tatian's Diatessaron, it speaks here of Jesus as being angry. Now think about that for a moment. If he's right, then Tatian's Diatessaron in the late 2nd century, which is combining Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John into one new written document, at least in this place, it's combining just Matthew, Mark, and Luke because John doesn't read in this passage. So what Ephraim is doing, or what Tatian is doing, is he's saying, let's combine Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And he comes up by saying Jesus is angry. This tells us pretty darn conclusively that in Mark's gospel, at least according to what Tatian had in the 2nd century, it said that Jesus was angry. That becomes significant. And of course, we know that Matthew and Luke don't say anything. They don't say he's compassionate or angry. And then the rest of the witnesses actually have moved with compassion, as we've talked about. So, genealogical solidarity, Alexandrian and Byzantine texts solidly behind the compassionate Jesus. The Western text is strongly in support of the angry Jesus. Geographical distribution, moved with compassion, is widespread, becoming angry, largely isolated to the Western text, but not entirely. With Tatian's Diatessaron and Ephraim, we're dealing with something that's Eastern as well. So the external evidence, I'd still give it a solid A for moved with compassion. Well, that means we've got a solid A on one side, for internally and a solid A on the other side externally. So let's think about a conclusion and a postscript on this. As you know, what we're always trying to do is choose the reading that best explains the rise of the other reading. The synoptic parallels, I think, show clearly that Mark's Jesus was angry. And by the way, this is just a little side note. This is for free. It won't show up on the test. Bart Ehrman wrote a chapter in Gerald Hawthorne's Festschrift. Hawthorne was one of his professors at Wheaton College, and the chapter title was A Sinner in the Hands of an Angry Jesus. And one of the things that Ehrman argued in that chapter was that we actually do have first century manuscripts of Mark's gospel. Now, elsewhere, he has complained we don't have anything earlier than 3rd century. But in this chapter, he says we actually do have 1st century manuscripts of Mark. They are Matthew and Luke. That is, that Matthew and Luke used Mark, and the very fact that they don't speak of Jesus as being compassionate shows that that's what Mark did not say in this place. And I think that Ehrman is quite right. It's a very convincing argument, but it proves too much for his views because he likes to say we can't possibly even get back to the 1st century documents or the 2nd century. We have no idea what they looked at. But when it serves his purposes, he'll say, oh yeah, we got 1st century documents, Matthew and Luke. And so I think he's quite right that we actually can recover the wording of Mark's gospel and Matthew's and Luke's because of these parallels. Is one of the tools we use. Well, these scribes would be prone to change a text to a compassionate Jesus, as we've already talked about. And although the Western text is wild, it is also very early. Some have suggested that, well, this Western text, they may have confused splonkus thais with orgus thais. But when you actually look at the text of Bazai, this is the one scribe that we would expect that to happen the least of, because that scribe was not writing out syllable by syllable or even word for word. He's writing many words at a shot, writing everything in sense lines. So I could say, if I'm looking at, say, Codex Sinaiticus, where he's writing more like syllable by syllable, I could see how the scribe could make the mistake between splonkus thais and orgus thais, but not Codex Bazai. It was Hort who said that knowledge of manuscripts must precede decisions about these readings. We need to know what each one of these scribes is doing, and the best way for scholars to do this is to spend a lot of time with each individual manuscript. Years ago when I was collating through a number of different majuscules just for fun, because that's what I like to do in my spare time, or I did. Now I like to just relax. But I think I felt as if I knew these scribes so well, I almost knew what they had for breakfast that day. It was just, you get to know the personality and the way in which these people write. It's just an absolutely fascinating process. Well, the Western text also does not have an angrier Jesus anywhere else. So it's not a proclivity intentionally, and it's certainly not a proclivity unintentionally. How do you explain that Jesus was angry in the Western manuscripts and the Intations Diatessaron, and not in Matthew and Luke, and they don't even mention that he's compassionate? It looks to me as if what we're really saying here is that in Mark chapter 1, verse 41, Jesus truly was angry. So that's the reading that I think is authentic. Now, let me give you a postscript on this for us to think about this in some other ways. Why was Jesus angry? The ambiguity here is in keeping with Mark's style. More than a dozen reasons have been suggested. Even one dissertation argued that, well, this, even though he was a leper, it has all the signs of maybe being a demon-possessed, and Jesus was angry at the demon. Ehrman says that Jesus was always angry when his desire or his ability to heal was challenged. Frankly, that's so overstated, it's pretty amazing. And I've dealt with this. I wrote an article for the Journal of the Evangelical Theological Society called The Gospel According to Bart, and I have a lengthy footnote where I discuss this in some detail and say this is an unsupportable conclusion. He cannot say that Jesus was always angry when his desire or ability to heal was challenged. It's just unsupportable. I think a better option, but I'm not absolutely sure of this option. This is the ambiguity of Mark that we're dealing with, is that this leper came to the synagogue to be healed. And thus he defiled the people who were there. In Mark 1:39, 2 verses earlier, it says, he, that is Jesus, went throughout Galilee preaching in their synagogues. Now, if that verse is setting up this scene, which it looks like it's doing, then when this leper came to Jesus, this was in the synagogue. And so Jesus would have been angry at him for completely disrespecting the Old Testament law. Jesus, you remember, did not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. And so when people were disrespecting these tenets that were very important, there was good reason for Jesus to be angry. Now, as far as I know, in terms of English translations, there's only 2 translations today that have an angry Jesus here, and that's the TNIV and the NIV 2011, both on the same textual basis. Gordon Fee was the textual critic for these versions. And I think the Net Bible in its next edition will have an angry Jesus whenever that next edition comes out. But this is a significant variant, and yet we see that Jesus is angry at other times for various reasons. Anger is not the same as sin. And that's one of the things we need to keep in mind. He has righteous indignation. And so that gives us a good sense about what's going on in this passage. I think it helps us to understand Jesus better, and yet to understand him less. It's kind of like the kids in Chronicles of Narnia when they love Aslan the lion. He's their best friend, and yet they're still nervous around him. That's the kind of a picture I get of Jesus in Mark 1:41. Thank you very much.
Hello, this is Tim. I'm the Executive Director of the Credo House, and I hope that you've been enjoying and loving these Credo courses. Just want to take a quick second that what you see, what's happening in the background there, that is not a production studio that we made just for the Credo courses, but that is called the Inklings Room. The Inklings Room is just one of the 3 rooms at the Credo House. Right now, I'm in the big room where you can hear a latte machine going on behind me, music happening in here. We typically get several hundred people every week coming in our doors, where we are what we think is one of the most unique evangelistic places that exists, where we just want to be on the front lines of the intellectual persecution of the church today. And so we invite you that if you're ever in Edmond, Oklahoma, to come and get a latte from the Credo House, hang out here, but then go into the Inklings Room where we film the Credo courses. It's a great room. We can tell you about the history of the Inklings, tell you about that room, and then our other super secret map room as well. But you can learn about that at credohouse.org, or we invite you to come and hang out with us over a Luther latte at the Credo House.